The knock on the door came on a gray afternoon in October 1990, 45 years after the war had ended. Lieselotte Schroeder, now 69 years old, wasn't expecting anyone. Her children were visiting for the weekend, a rare occasion that brought all three of them back to the small house in Bavaria where they'd grown up. The house still had the same wallpaper from the 1950s, faded flowers that had witnessed decades of quiet struggle and small victories. When she opened the door, she found an elderly American man standing there, his hands trembling slightly, his eyes carrying a weight she couldn't quite name. He was tall but stooped, wearing a simple jacket and holding a worn leather briefcase. He asked in broken German if she was the widow of Ernst Schroeder. When she nodded, confused and slightly alarmed, he said 5 words that would shatter everything she thought she knew about her husband's death. "I was there. I'm sorry." It was April 1945. The Third Reich was collapsing like a house built on sand, each day bringing new reports of territory lost, armies surrendering, the Führer's promises revealed as the delusions they'd always been. Cities lay in ruins, smoke rising from what had once been neighborhoods, factories, lives. Berlin was encircled. The western and eastern fronts were closing in like a vice. In the chaos, millions of people were on the move. Refugees fleeing the advancing Red Army, displaced persons liberated from camps, soldiers deserting or trying to surrender to the Western Allies rather than face Soviet captivity. The Allied forces pushed deeper into German territory, encountering pockets of resistance that ranged from fanatical SS units fighting to the last man to exhausted Wehrmacht soldiers who just wanted to go home to whatever remained of their families and homes. The lines between combat and chaos had blurred beyond recognition. Orders were unclear. Communication was spotty. In those final weeks, anything could happen, and much of it would never make it into official reports. The rules of war, already bent and broken countless times over 6 years of conflict, became even more flexible as victory approached, and the desire for revenge mingled with exhaustion and the simple human wish for it all to be over. Elwood Hartfield was 22 years old, a private in the United States Army, part of a unit that had fought its way from Normandy through France and into the heart of Germany. He'd landed on Omaha Beach 3 weeks after D-Day, seen friends die in the hedgerows of Normandy where every field was a potential death trap, fought through the frozen hell of the Ardennes during the Battle of the Bulge, where frostbite killed almost as many men as German bullets. He'd walked through liberated concentration camps and seen things that made him physically sick, that made him question everything he thought he knew about human nature. He'd watched civilians caught in the crossfire, children crying over parents who would never wake up, old people standing in the ruins of their homes with nowhere to go and nothing left. By April, something had hardened inside him, a shell that kept the horror at bay but also kept out things like mercy and nuance. He'd stopped thinking of the enemy as individuals with families and stories. They were just uniforms, targets, obstacles between him and the end of the war. Most of the men in his unit felt the same way. They were tired, angry, traumatized in ways they didn't yet have words for. They'd lost too many friends. They'd seen too much death. And now, so close to victory, the last thing anyone wanted was to be the last man killed in a war that was already decided. His platoon, led by Sergeant Virgil Pemberton, a career soldier with a face like weathered leather and eyes that had seen too much, was moving through a small town near the Bavarian border when they encountered a group of German soldiers attempting to surrender. It was mid-afternoon, the spring sun struggling to break through gray clouds. The town was mostly deserted, civilians hiding in cellars or already fled. There were maybe a dozen German soldiers, dirty, exhausted, some barely old enough to shave, others old enough to be grandfathers. They'd thrown down their weapons in a pile by the side of the road and raised their hands, shouting the few English words they knew. "Kamerad, no shoot, war finish." Standard procedure was clear. Disarm them, search them for intelligence materials or concealed weapons, document their unit and rank, send them back to the prisoner collection point where they'd be processed and eventually sent to POW camps. But standard procedure had become more of a suggestion than a rule in those chaotic final days. Some units followed it meticulously, others didn't. It depended on the officers, the mood of the men, what they'd seen that day or that week, whether anyone was watching. Ernst Schroeder was among those surrendering soldiers. He was 26, a school teacher before the war, a man who'd loved literature and music and long walks in the countryside. He'd been drafted in 1940 and sent to fight in a cause he'd never fully believed in. He'd seen the propaganda, heard the speeches, but he'd also seen the reality, the brutality, the waste, the slow realization that everything they'd been told was a lie. He'd survived the Eastern Front, which killed most of the men who went there. He'd survived France after D-Day, retreating along with the collapsing German armies. And now, in the final days, he'd decided that survival meant surrender. He had Lieselotta's last letter folded in his breast pocket, written 2 months earlier, smuggled through the increasingly chaotic postal system. She'd told him about their newborn son Manfred, born in January, a healthy baby with his father's dark hair. She'd written about how 4-year-old Gunther asked about him every night before bed, asking when Papa would come home, whether the war was almost over. She'd described how 2-year-old Hildegard had started saying Papa, even though she barely remembered his face, pointing at his photograph on the mantel. Lieselotta had written about the difficulties, the food shortages, the bombing raids, but she'd also written about hope, about the future they'd build when he came home, about the life they'd planned before the war interrupted everything. Ernst had been planning what he'd say to them when he got home, practicing the words in his head during long marches and cold nights in foxholes. He'd apologize for being gone so long. He'd hold his children and memorize their faces. He'd tell Lieselotta that she was the only thing that had kept him sane through 6 years of insanity. He'd go back to teaching, help rebuild the school that had been damaged in a bombing raid. He'd plant a garden. He'd take Gunther fishing like his own father had taken him. He'd teach Hildegard to read. He'd get to know the son he'd never met. These dreams had sustained him through the worst moments. And now, with his hands raised and his weapons discarded, he thought maybe, finally, he'd get the chance to make them real. The surrender should have been simple. The German soldiers were clearly defeated, clearly unarmed, clearly just wanting to survive the last days of a lost war. But one of them, a boy who couldn't have been more than 17, panicked. Maybe he thought he saw a weapon being raised. Maybe he just couldn't handle the tension anymore, the way the American soldiers were looking at them with hard eyes and tight grips on their rifles. Maybe he had some half-formed idea of escape. Whatever the reason, he reached toward his belt, a reflexive motion that could have been anything, reaching for something that wasn't there, and everything exploded. An American soldier fired. The young German fell, blood spreading across his uniform. And then, in the confusion and adrenaline and rage that had been building for months, for years, discipline evaporated. More shots rang out. Some of the German soldiers hit the ground, trying to make themselves small. Others tried to run. It became chaos, a massacre dressed up as combat, the kind of thing that happened more often than anyone wanted to admit in those final brutal days. Elwood saw Ernst trying to back away, hands still raised high above his head, shouting something in German that Elwood couldn't understand. Later, much later, after he'd learned some German and replayed that moment in his head thousands of times, he would learn it was, Ich habe Kinder, ich habe Kinder, I have children, I have children. But in that moment, with his finger on the trigger and his heart pounding and the faces of dead friends flashing through his mind, with Sergeant Pemberton shouting orders that got lost in the noise, with the smell of cordite and blood in the air, Elwood fired. Ernst fell into the mud, blood spreading across his Wehrmacht uniform, Lieselotta's letter still tucked against his heart. His eyes stayed open for a moment, looking up at the gray sky, perhaps seeing his children's faces one last time, perhaps seeing nothing at all. Then they closed, and Ernst Schroeder, who'd survived so much and come so close to making it home, was gone. Sergeant Pemberton called for ceasefire. The scene went quiet except for the moaning of the wounded and the ringing in everyone's ears. There were 5 German soldiers dead, including Ernst. 3 were wounded. 4 had managed to survive unharmed, lying face down in the mud praying this was over. The official report, filed 2 days later when anyone got around to paperwork, would list them as enemy combatants killed during attempted surrender, hostile action suspected. No investigation, no questions, no consequences. Just one more statistic in a war that had already produced tens of millions of them. The platoon moved on within the hour. There was still ground to cover, still objectives to secure, still a war to finish even though everyone knew it was essentially over. Elwood tried not to think about it. He told himself it had been necessary. that the German soldier had made a threatening move, that in combat you don't have time to think, you just react. But he couldn't stop seeing Ernst's face, the way his eyes had gone wide with terror and desperate hope, the way he'd reached out as if trying to grab onto life itself before it slipped away. That image would follow Elwood for the rest of his life, appearing in quiet moments, in dreams, in the space between waking and sleeping. Back in Bavaria, Lieselotte was living in her parents' small house with her 3 children, waiting for news that never came. Her father had died in 1943. Her mother was frail and increasingly confused. The town was occupied by American forces now. There was food rationing, though the Americans were more generous than the Nazi authorities had been in the final months. There were curfews, checkpoints, the constant presence of soldiers in jeeps patrolling streets that had once been peaceful. The occupation was relatively benign compared to what was happening in the Soviet zone, but it was still occupation, still defeat, still the daily reminder that they'd lost everything. Lieselotte worked whatever jobs she could find. She cleaned houses for the occupation officers, mended clothes, helped with the harvest on nearby farms, anything to feed her children and keep a roof over their heads. The widow's pension wouldn't start for months, and when it did, it would barely cover rent. Every day she hoped for a letter from Ernst. Every day she checked the casualty list posted in the town square. Every day there was nothing, and the nothing was somehow worse than bad news because it left room for hope that became more painful as the weeks turned into months. It was his brother Helmut who finally brought the news in July 1945. He'd been in a different unit, captured by the British in March, held in a POW camp in Belgium, released in June when the camp started processing the massive backlog of prisoners. He'd spent weeks tracking down information about Ernst, asking other survivors, checking with the Red Cross, piecing together fragments of stories from men who'd been in the same sector. What he learned was vague and terrible. Ernst's unit had attempted to surrender to American forces in late April, somewhere near the Bavarian border. There had been shooting. Several men had been killed. Ernst was among them. Helmut didn't know the details. Couldn't tell Lieselotte whether Ernst had died quickly or slowly, whether he'd suffered, whether he'd had any last words. The official Wehrmacht records, such as they were in that chaos, simply listed Ernst as killed in action on April 28, 1945, 3 days before Hitler's suicide, 10 days before the final surrender. Lieselotte held her infant son and cried for hours, the grief made worse by all those weeks of not knowing, of hoping against hope that maybe he'd been captured, maybe he was in a hospital somewhere, maybe he'd just been separated from his unit and would walk through the door any day. Lieselotte became one of thousands, hundreds of thousands of German war widows. The statistics were staggering. Over 5 million German soldiers dead, countless more wounded or missing. In some towns, there were hardly any men left between the ages of 20 and 40. The Witwenrente, the widow's pension, was barely enough to survive on, calculated in a currency that was rapidly becoming worthless as inflation spiraled. She raised her children in a country that was divided, occupied, and struggling to rebuild from total destruction. She told Gunther, Hildegard, and Manfred that their father had been a good man, that he'd died in the war, that he'd loved them very much. She showed them the few photographs she had. Ernst in his wedding suit, Ernst holding baby Gunther, Ernst in his uniform before he shipped out, young and serious and trying to look brave. She read them his letters, the ones that had made it through the censors, full of vague reassurances and carefully worded love. She kept his memory alive in the only way she could, building a mythology of the absent father, the man who would have been there if he could, who'd wanted nothing more than to come home. But she never knew exactly how he died. She imagined it had been in combat, maybe defending his position, maybe covering a retreat, maybe in one of the final desperate battles. She never imagined it had been while surrendering, hands raised begging for his life. She never imagined that somewhere in America, a man was carrying the memory of pulling the trigger, living a normal life, while her husband lay in an unmarked grave. Elwood returned to the United States in the summer of 1945. There were parades in New York, celebrations in every town, the GI Bill promising education and home loans. He married Evelyn, a girl he'd known before the war, someone from his hometown who wrote him letters while he was overseas. They settled in Ohio, in a small house with a white picket fence. He found work as a machinist in a factory that had converted from making artillery shells to making automobile parts. They had 2 children, a boy and a girl. To everyone around him, he was a veteran like any other, someone who'd done his duty and come home, who'd helped win the war, and now deserved his share of the prosperity and peace. He didn't talk much about the war. When people asked, and they did less and less as the years went by and new concerns replaced old ones, he gave the standard answers. It was tough. He'd lost some friends. He was glad it was over. He didn't like to dwell on it. He went to a few veteran reunions in the early years but stopped going because the drinking and the stories made him uncomfortable. He never mentioned Ernst Schroeder. He never told Evelyn about that day in April. He locked it away in a part of himself that he tried not to access, tried to pretend it didn't exist. But Ernst haunted him, not in any supernatural sense, but in the quiet moments, the early mornings before dawn when he'd wake up and couldn't get back to sleep, the nights when insomnia kept him staring at the ceiling while Evelyn slept peacefully beside him. Elwood would see that face, those raised hands, hear that desperate voice shouting words he couldn't understand. He'd replay the moment wondering if he could have hesitated, if he could have aimed differently, if he could have been the one person in that chaos who chose mercy over violence. As the years passed and the initial numbness of post-war life wore off, the guilt grew heavier instead of lighter. He started reading about Germany, about the reconstruction, about the families left behind. He learned that there were millions of war widows, millions of fatherless children, that the human cost of the war extended far beyond the battlefield. He thought about Ernst's uniform, how worn it had been, how the man had looked more exhausted than dangerous. He thought about what might have been in that soldier's pockets, whether he'd had a family, whether somewhere a woman and children were waiting for a man who would never come home because of what Elwood had done. By the 1970s, something had shifted in how America talked about war. Vietnam had complicated the narrative of righteous combat, had forced people to confront uncomfortable questions about what soldiers did and what it cost them. Veterans were starting to speak more openly about trauma, about PTSD before it had that name, about the things they'd done and seen that didn't fit into the heroic stories. Elwood attended a few veteran gatherings, heard other men talk about guilt and regret, about the difference between what was necessary and what was simply violence dressed up in the uniform of necessity. He started to wonder if he could find out who Ernst Schroeder had been, whether his family was still alive, whether there was any way to make amends for something that had happened 30 years earlier. The idea seemed crazy at first. What would he even say? How do you apologize for killing someone? What right did he have to disrupt their lives with his guilt? But the idea wouldn't leave him alone. It grew stronger as he got older, as his own children grew up and had children of their own, as he watched his son hold his grandson and thought about the man who never got to do that because of a split-second decision in the chaos of war. The search took years. Military records from that chaotic period were incomplete, especially for German units that had ceased to exist in the final collapse. The town where it had happened had changed. Borders had shifted. Germany had been divided into East and West and then reunified in 1990. But Elwood was persistent in a way that surprised even himself. He contacted veteran organizations, wrote letters to German archives, hired a researcher in Munich who specialized in tracking down war records. Slowly, piece by piece, he assembled the story. Ernst Schroeder, born March 15, 1919, in Bavaria. Schoolteacher. Drafted 1940, served on the Eastern Front, transferred west in 1944, married to Lieselotte Brandt in 1940. 3 children, Günther, born 1941, Hildegard, born 1943, Manfred, born January 1945, last known address in a small Bavarian town. The researcher found that Lieselotte was still alive, still living in the same area, now an elderly widow who'd never remarried. The children were all alive, all living in Germany, all now middle-aged with families of their own. Elwood was 67 years old when he finally decided to go. It was 1990, 45 years after the war had ended. Evelyn thought he was crazy, worried about his health, worried about what this might do to him emotionally. But she also understood that her husband had been carrying something heavy for decades, that it had shaped their entire marriage in ways neither of them had fully acknowledged, and maybe this was the only way to put it down. In October, he flew to Germany, rented a car, drove to the small Bavarian town that looked nothing like it had in 1945. He found the address, a small house on a quiet street, flowers in the window boxes, everything neat and well-maintained. He sat in the car for 20 minutes trying to figure out what he would say, how you apologize for killing someone's husband, someone's father. There were no words that would be adequate, no speech that could make this right. But he'd come this far. He couldn't turn back now. He owed Ernst this much to face the family he'd destroyed, to give them the truth even if it brought nothing but pain. When Lieselotte opened the door and he introduced himself in his broken German, her first reaction was confusion. An American veteran wanting to talk about Ernst? It wasn't unheard of, these reconciliation visits. There had been documentaries about former enemies meeting decades later, shaking hands, forgiving each other. But those usually involved men who'd fought against each other and survived. When Elwood said he'd been there when Ernst died, her confusion turned to intense focus. When he said he was sorry, she asked why, her voice sharp with sudden suspicion. And then, standing in her doorway with her children gathering behind her, Elwood told her the truth. He told her about the surrender, about the group of German soldiers with their hands raised. He told her about the confusion, about the young soldier who'd panicked, about how the shooting started. He told her about Ernst backing away with his hands raised, shouting in German. He told her that he'd fired, that Ernst had fallen, that it hadn't been combat in any real sense, that her husband had been trying to give up and go home, and had been killed anyway. He told her that he'd carried this for 45 years, and that he needed her to know the truth, even if she hated him for it, even if it made everything worse, because she deserved to know, and because he couldn't die with this secret still locked inside him. Lieselotte stood frozen, her hand still on the doorknob. Behind her, her 3 children had gathered, drawn by the strange conversation in the doorway. Günther, now 49, a civil engineer with his father's serious eyes and careful manner. Hildegard, 47, a teacher like Ernst had been, who'd spent her career trying to honor a father she barely remembered. Manfred, 45, an accountant, who'd never met the father he was named after but had always felt his absence like a phantom limb. They listened as this elderly American man described their father's last moments in detail they'd never had before, detail they'd never wanted, detail that rewrote everything they thought they knew about his death. The silence that followed was suffocating. Günther's face had gone red, his fists clenched at his sides. Hildegard was crying quietly, tears running down her face. Manfred just stared, processing this information that changed his entire understanding of his family history, of the absence that had defined his childhood. Lieselotte's hands were shaking. For 45 years she'd lived with an incomplete story, a vague narrative of death in combat, imagining her husband had died fighting, maybe even heroically. Now she had the full picture, and it was so much worse than she'd imagined. Her husband hadn't died fighting. He'd died surrendering. He'd died with his hands up, begging for mercy that never came. Killed by men who were supposed to take prisoners. Killed in the final days when the war was already over, and everyone knew it. Elwood didn't try to justify it. He didn't talk about the stress of combat or the fog of war, or any of the things that might have made it more understandable. He didn't blame Sergeant Pemberton or the young German who'd panicked. He just stood there, an old man who'd traveled thousands of miles to confess to a killing that no court would ever prosecute, that no official record would ever correct, that the world had long since forgotten if it ever knew. He'd come because he believed they deserved to know the truth, and because he couldn't die with this secret still locked inside him, because whatever peace he might find had to come from facing what he'd done, not from hiding from it. Günther was the first to speak. His voice was tight with rage, decades of grief suddenly given a target. You came here to feel better about yourself? You think saying sorry fixes anything? You took our father from us. Do you have any idea what that meant? Growing up without him, watching our mother work herself to exhaustion just to keep us fed, being the defeated ones, the children of the enemy, having to rebuild everything from nothing, and not even having him there to help, to explain any of it. Do you have any idea what it's like to grow up with just a photograph and some letters and a hole where a father should be? Elwood shook his head slowly. No, I don't. I can't. I don't expect forgiveness. I don't expect this to fix anything. I don't expect you to understand why I came. I just thought you deserved to know what really happened. I thought he deserved to be remembered as more than a statistic, more than just another name on a casualty list. I thought you deserved to know that in his last moments he was trying to come home to you. Hildegard wiped her eyes, her voice breaking. What was he saying? when he was backing away. Do you remember? What were his last words? Elwood's voice cracked, and for a moment he couldn't speak. Then quietly, I didn't understand German then, but I never forgot the sound of his voice, the way he said it. Years later I found someone to translate from what I remembered. He was saying, Ich habe Kinder. I have children, over and over. I have children. I have children. He was trying to tell us that he had a reason to live, that people needed him. He was trying to tell us that his life mattered. That broke something in the room. Lieselotte made a sound like she'd been physically struck, a gasp of pain that came from somewhere deep. Manfred turned away, his shoulders shaking with sobs for a father he'd never known but suddenly felt more acutely than ever. Günther's anger seemed to collapse into grief, his face crumpling. Ernst hadn't just been killed. He'd died trying to tell his killer that he was a father, that people needed him, that his life meant something beyond the uniform he wore and the side he'd fought for. They invited Elwood inside, not because they forgave him, not because it made anything better, but because the truth, however painful, deserved more than a doorstep conversation. Because this man had traveled so far to tell them something he could have kept secret forever. Because maybe, in some twisted way, he was the only living connection they had to their father's final moments, and that meant something even if it was terrible. They sat in the small living room where Ernst's photograph still hung on the wall, a young man in uniform looking seriously at the camera, trying to look brave for his family. This was the room where his children had grown up in his absence, where Lieselotte had raised them alone, where they'd celebrated birthdays and Christmases and graduations without him. And now, 45 years later, the man who'd killed him sat in their father's house and told them the story they'd never known they needed to hear. Elwood told them everything he remembered about that day. The gray sky, the muddy road, the exhausted German soldiers with their hands raised, the moment of panic, the chaos that followed, how Ernst had fallen, how long it had taken him to die, what Elwood had felt in that moment and in all the years since. He left nothing out, offered no excuses, presented the truth in all its ugly complexity. Lieselotte told him about Ernst, about who he'd been before the war, a gentle man who loved books and music, who'd wanted to be a writer but had become a teacher because it was more practical, about the letters he'd sent from the front, carefully worded to get past the censors but full of love and longing, about the life they'd planned to build when he came home, the house they'd wanted to buy, the garden they'd wanted to plant, the simple ordinary future that had been stolen from them, about how hard it had been to raise 3 children alone in the rubble of defeat, how she'd worked her fingers to the bone, how she'd never remarried because no one could replace Ernst, because she'd made a vow, and she'd kept it even though he was gone. Günther talked about the few memories he had, fragments really, his father teaching him to tie his shoes, reading him a story, lifting him up to see over a fence, how he'd clung to those memories, polished them like precious stones, built an entire image of his father from those tiny pieces, how he'd tried to be the man his father would have wanted him to be, even though he'd had to guess at what that meant. Hildegard talked about growing up with only photographs and stories, how she'd become a teacher partly to honor him, how she'd always wondered if she'd inherited his love of literature, or if that was just wishful thinking, how she'd named her own son Ernst, trying to keep the name alive, trying to maintain some connection to a grandfather he'd never meet. Manfred talked about the absence, the hole that had shaped his entire life, how he'd always felt like he was missing something essential, how every Father's Day and every birthday had been a reminder of what he'd never had, how he'd sometimes felt angry at his father for dying, for leaving them, even though he knew it wasn't Ernst's fault, even though he knew his father would have come home if he could. Waltraud Becker, Lieselotte's neighbor and fellow war widow, came over when she heard the commotion. She'd lost her husband Dieter on the Eastern Front in 1943, had raised her own children alone through the same hardships. She listened to Elwood's story with the quiet attention of someone who understood grief and guilt in equal measure. When he finished, she said something that surprised everyone. At least now you know. At least now he's not just missing, not just a casualty report. At least now someone remembers his last moments and cared enough to come tell you. That's more than most of us ever got. Most of us will never know exactly how or where or why. We just have the absence. You have the truth now. It's terrible, but it's something. It wasn't forgiveness exactly. It wasn't closure. A word that wouldn't become popular for another decade and that would never quite capture the messy reality of grief and trauma. But it was something. A recognition that war had broken everyone in different ways. That guilt and grief were two sides of the same coin. That the man who'd pulled the trigger had also been destroyed by that moment, just differently. That carrying that guilt for 45 years, letting it shape his entire life and finally having the courage to face it, meant something even if it couldn't undo the harm. Elwood stayed for 3 hours. He showed them a photograph he'd brought, one taken of his platoon a week before Ernst died. Young men trying to look tough for the camera, as if proving he'd really been there, as if documentation mattered. He gave Lieselot an envelope with money, not as payment because no amount could ever be enough, but as a gesture, a small practical help after decades of struggle. She almost refused it, her pride warring with practicality. But Manfred quietly told her to take it, that they could donate it to a veterans charity if she didn't want to keep it, but that refusing the gesture would accomplish nothing, that letting this man try to make some small amends was perhaps the only grace they could offer. When Elwood finally stood to leave, his joints stiff from sitting, his face drawn with exhaustion, Gunther walked him to the door. The anger had faded, replaced by a bone-deep exhaustion that felt older than his 49 years. "I don't forgive you," he said quietly, looking directly into Elwood's eyes. "I don't know if I ever can. What you did took our father from us, and nothing can give us back those years. But I'm glad you came. I'm glad you told us the truth. It's better than not knowing. It's better than the story we told ourselves. At least now we know he tried to come home. At least now we know someone remembers." Elwood nodded, his own eyes wet. "That's more than I deserve. Thank you for listening. Thank you for not slamming the door in my face. I know it doesn't change anything, but I needed you to know that I've thought about him every day for 45 years. That he mattered. That what happened mattered. That I'm sorry, even though sorry doesn't begin to cover it." He drove back to his hotel through streets that looked nothing like they had in 1945, past rebuilt churches and modern shops and people going about their ordinary lives. He cried for the first time in decades. Great heaving sobs that shook his whole body, releasing something that had been locked inside him for most of his adult life. He flew home 2 days later, back to Ohio, back to Evelyn, back to his ordinary life that would never quite be ordinary again. He'd done what he came to do. The guilt didn't disappear. It would never disappear, but it had shifted somehow. He'd faced the people he'd wronged. He'd given them the truth. He'd offered what amends he could, inadequate as they were. It wasn't redemption, but it was responsibility, and maybe that was the best he could hope for. Maybe that was all anyone could hope for when trying to make peace with the irredeemable. Lieselot lived another 25 years, passing away in 2015 at the age of 94. In her later years, she spoke occasionally about Elwood's visit, about how strange it had been, how painful, but also how it had answered questions that had haunted her for half a century. She never said she forgave him, but she also never said she hated him. It was more complicated than that, a tangle of emotions that couldn't be reduced to simple categories of forgiveness or condemnation. She kept the photograph he'd given her, the one of his platoon, and sometimes she'd look at it and try to imagine what Ernst's last moments had really been like now that she knew. Elwood died in 2018 at the age of 95. In his final years, suffering from the various ailments of extreme old age but mentally sharp until nearly the end, he'd told his children and grandchildren about Ernst Schroeder, about the visit to Germany, about the importance of facing what you've done, even when it's easier to look away. His grandson, moved by the story, later traveled to Bavaria and met Manfred, who was by then in his 70s. They shared a meal and stories about two men who'd never known each other, but whose lives had been forever connected by one terrible moment in April 1945. The photograph of Ernst still hangs in what is now Hildegard's house, passed down as she became the keeper of family history. Next to it, she placed a small note card with the date April 28, 1945, and below it, the words, "He tried to come home." It's a small memorial to a man who died with his hands raised, whose last words were about his children, who was killed not in honorable combat but in chaos and fear, and the ugly reality of war that doesn't make it into the heroic narratives. War creates these stories by the millions. Most of them are never told. Most of the people who carry them die with them locked inside, the guilt or grief, or both buried so deep that even their families never know the full truth. Elwood Hartfield's decision to return, to confess, to face the family of the man he killed, was unusual. Some would call it brave, a difficult moral act that took more courage than anything he'd done in combat. Others would call it selfish, a way to ease his own conscience at the expense of reopening old wounds, of forcing a family to relive their trauma so he could feel better about himself. Maybe it was both. Maybe it was neither. Maybe it was just one old man's attempt to face the truth before he died, to take responsibility for something he could never undo, to offer the only thing he had left to give, the truth, however painful. What's certain is that on a gray October afternoon in 1990, 3 people who'd spent their entire lives with an incomplete story about their father finally learned the truth. It didn't bring him back. It didn't undo the decades of absence and struggle. It didn't erase the poverty and hardship and grief, but it gave them something they'd never had before, a witness to his final moments, someone who could say, "I was there. This is what happened. Your father's last thoughts were of you, and I'm sorry." In a world where so many deaths go unmarked and unmourned, where so many soldiers become nothing more than names on a memorial or numbers in a casualty report, maybe that mattered. The knock on the door came 45 years too late to change anything, but it came. And sometimes in the wreckage that war leaves behind, in the long shadow cast by violence and loss, that's the only kind of redemption anyone gets. Not forgiveness, not absolution, not the restoration of what was lost, but simply the acknowledgement of truth, the facing of responsibility, the recognition that what happened mattered and that the people involved were human beings with names and families and futures that were stolen from them. If you found this story powerful and want to hear more untold stories from history, please subscribe to our channel, leave a like, and share your thoughts in the comments below. These stories matter. These voices deserve to be heard. Your engagement helps us continue bringing them to light.